Well, in 1971, Brian De Palma was invited to direct a picture at Warner Brothers called Get to Know Your Rabbit with Tommy Smothers and Orson Welles, among others, and Catherine Ross. And he was not able to hire me. I had cut Hi Mom with him previously, but he had to hire a studio editor, and I wasn't even in the union at that point. And he went out to LA. We were both living in New York at the time. And he went out to LA and he cut this picture with another editor. And the picture turned out to be rather disastrous for Brian. He was fired from it. And subsequently, he came back to New York and he got the money to do a little independent horror film called Sisters, and he hired me to cut that. And Sisters was a fair success. Ed Pressman decided to do another film with Brian called Phantom, which was loosely based on Phantom of the Opera, and it was to be a sort of a rock musical. So during the time that Brian had been at Warner Brothers in 1971, there was another young director on the lot doing his first film, his first studio film, and his name was George Lucas. And Lucas and De Palma were the only directors on the lot who had beards. So they became friendly. And when Brian did Phantom, George saw the film. He was friends with Brian. He saw the picture, and he admired my work in it. 20th Century Fox picked up the film as a negative pickup deal, and Brian called me from LA and said, "You got to get out here. There's a tremendous amount of excitement about this picture. They're going to have a screening on the lot at 20th Century Fox, and then they're going to have a little party afterwards." So I flew out and I went to the screening and I went to the party, and at the party I met Marsha Lucas, and she said, "Oh, you're the editor? Come here, George wants to meet you." And she grabbed me by the hand and she pulled me through the crowd, and she brought me over to George, and George had just directed American Graffiti, which was huge. And I met him, and he was very unassuming. He was in blue jeans, and he had a white shirt rolled up at up to his elbows and hanging out of his pants. And he looked like a regular guy. And he said, "Boy, you did a great job." And I said, "Thank you." And then there were subsequent problems with Phantom, and it had to be retitled Phantom of the Paradise, and that's a whole other story in itself. But that's when I first came to George's attention. When I did Obsession with Brian, there were problems with that picture in terms of getting distribution. And I was working in New York, Brian was out in LA, and he was casting his next film. And we were talking on the phone quite frequently because of ideas I had about finishing Obsession. And George was casting Star Wars at the time. Brian was casting Carrie. And it turns out they were looking for actors in the same age range. So they decided to have their casting sessions together. And the actors would come in, and George would give the introductory speech, and Brian would give the closing speech. And sometimes Brian would start the closing speech before George had finished the introductory speech. And one day during a break in their work, Brian called me on the phone and he said, "George wants to speak to you." I said, "Okay." And George gets on the phone. He says, "Listen, I really love your work, and I just want to tell you that I'd like to work with you someday." He says, "I'm starting a big science fiction picture right now, and I already have an editor for it, but I'm going to be doing lots more pictures, and I'd love to have you do one after that." So I went home and I said to my wife, I said, "Well, George, wants me to work with him, but the one I'd really like to work on with him is the one he's doing now." So anyway, he went off to England to shoot Star Wars, and I cut Carrie with Brian, and I was initially unhappy about Carrie because we had done Sisters, which is a horror film, straight out thriller along the lines of Psycho. And then we did Phantom of the Paradise, which was sort of a musical slash comedy slash horror film, and it had horrific elements in it. And then we did Obsession, which was a much more high-toned romantic mystery along the lines of Vertigo. And I felt that when I read Carrie, I read about this girl who had supernatural powers, and I thought, and it was a horror film, and I thought it was a step backwards. And I'd hoped that to do more sort of higher toned films. So I was unhappy about it. I didn't really see the potential of Carrie as it read. I read the book. It was Stephen King's first novel and also the first of his works ever to be produced. And in the book, Carrie is very unattractive and clearly a victim and the kind of person that everyone would pick on. But Brian cast Sissy Spacek, who's enormously, she's beautiful and she's very sympathetic. So it really changed the whole equation of what Carrie was all about. And I hadn't really fully grasped how much fun it would be to be digging into Brian's bag of tricks, cinematic tricks. He has a great way of shooting sequences, and he has a very strong visual take on material, and it really was extremely enjoyable working on the film. Brian is great to work with as an editor because he gives you the freedom to do the first cut on your own, and then reacts to it. And I think in any job, the more autonomy you're given, the happier you are. And the other thing about Brian is that he has this great visual imagination. So sometimes he'll cover a scene all in one, or he'll make it into, the prom scene in Carrie had over 100 setups, and that was just the slow motion part that sets up the scene. So his shots are designed very much with point of view in mind, and he shoots characters and their points of view, and you're able to construct I was able to construct a scene in which all the characters and their motives are understood by showing the audience what they're seeing and how they are reacting to what they're seeing. So it's a language of film that Brian employs a lot, and with great success in Carrie. The split screen idea was something that he's been playing with for a long time. In 1969, he did a picture called Dionysus in '69, which was essentially a film of a performance of a play of that title, Dionysus in '69, by an off-Broadway theater troupe, experimental theater troupe. And I believe the whole film is in a split screen, and Brian edited it himself. So he was a big enthusiast of split screen. I always felt that split screen is interesting intellectually, but it distances you emotionally from what's going on, because you're reminded that, you're watching two images at once. You don't really lose yourself emotionally to that in the way that you do with a single image that you can relate to, a traditional identification with an audience, identification character. It's more of an intellectual kind of situation, and I was less enthusiastic about it than he was. Also, in those days, we were cutting on film, so to cut a split-screen sequence was enormously painstaking. You had to have a special moviola with two heads, and you're constantly locking and interlocking the two heads, and it was tedious. But he was committed to it, and we cut this prom sequence with split screen. The studio hated it, and they beat him down about it. And he finally said to me, just, you know, you do it. You know, he had done the first pass on it, I guess. And he said, you do it, you know. And the thing about this sequence is that when he shot it, he didn't protect the full frame. He knew he was going to use the shot for maybe the left side of the screen or maybe for the right side of the screen. So he left camera stands and all sorts of things in the half of the screen that he didn't intend to use. Occasionally he would shoot a frame that was protected the full frame. So whenever I had a full frame shot, I would use it. And whenever I didn't, I would keep the split screen. So that's why in the sequence it goes from full frame to split screen and so forth. And then, of course, when you get into split screen and points of view, you get into screen direction problems. So if Carrie is causing things to move by her look, if she looks here or she looks here, it's fine in a close-up. But if she's on one side of the screen and she looks here and she's on the left side of the screen, her look is in the wrong direction. So at one point, we actually had to move the close-up of Sissy across the screen so that her next look to the left would be in the right direction for the thing that reacted to her look. So it gets into problems. But I look at it today and it looks pretty good. I'm very happy with Carrie. Carrie was the first of the 5 films I did with Brian. The first one that I really endorsed every one of the cuts. I felt, you know, I don't disagree with any of this. Sometimes, you know, as an editor, you get overridden by the director. His sensibility is not exactly the same as yours, and he prefers something in a way that you really don't like, but you have to go along with. But Carrie, I really felt completely on board with everything that we did, and I was very pleased with the cut. Well, suspense involves tension, and tension often results, I would say almost entirely results from the feeling that time is running out. Without a clock going, as Brian calls it, without the clock running, the tension goes away. The famous example of that, of course, is High Noon, where the film wasn't testing well, and I think it was Elmo Williams. I think, if I'm not a film scholar, so I might have gotten that wrong. But the editor inserted shots of the clock showing the hands getting closer and closer to noon, so that he built a feeling of tension as Gary Cooper goes around the town trying to enlist people to help him face down these killers who are coming in on the noon train. Without that tension of the clock, the film just was flat. And by introducing a clock, you ratchet up the tension. I also give the example of somebody who's tied up trying to get free. Well, you can only watch that for very little time before you get very bored. Irvin Kershner, who directed Empire Strikes Back, used to say, physical difficulty is boring. And you watch somebody struggling with knots on their wrists, and you know, it's not very interesting. But if you intercut a locomotive coming their way and they're tied to a track, now you've introduced the element of time running out. So all of a sudden the tension becomes enormous. So suspense depends on a feeling of time is running out. And you have to have a clock going to really have it work successfully. Now you can have tension without suspense, like somebody walking into a dark room. And of course, Psycho is the great example of creating tension without suspense, where you have a terrible murder at the beginning of the movie, and then the rest of the movie, the audience is terrified it's going to happen again. So that horrible crime at the beginning sets up the tension that plays through every scene in the movie at that point. Well, I don't revisit it much. I mean, people ask me, do you watch your old movies? And I say never, because by the time I get to the end of completing a film, I'll have seen it, you know, thousands of times, and it's painful to watch. So sometimes I'll go back to it 20 years later, and like occasionally you're flipping channels or something, you come across picture. I'll come across a picture I cut, and sometimes I'll tune in just to remind myself. And sometimes I can watch it for a few minutes, and occasionally it hooks me, and I get pulled in, and I watch it all the way to the end. That happened to me, I was in Montreal, and they were showing Phantom of the Paradise in French. So I thought that was interesting to watch it dubbed into French. And when I come across Ferris Bueller, I usually get hooked into that, and I watch it through to the end. But Carrie, I would say, Carrie, I think the highlight of Carrie is the prom sequence, because it involved so many setups, and it took 2 weeks to shoot just that one scene. So it had great camera movements, and the slow motion and the split screen, and action, and it was most memorable for me. Well, there was a special effects stunt that didn't work, so it created problems. There was a prologue that we never used, in which Carrie is seen as a little girl playing outside her house, and you hear Margaret White's voice from inside the house calling her. Carrie's outside talking to the girl next door, who's a bit older and has developed breasts, and Carrie refers to them as dirty pillows. And the girl says, "What? What are you talking about?" She says, "My mama calls them dirty pillows." And then you hear Carrie's mother calling her to come inside, and Carrie gets all upset, and out of the clear blue sky, small stones begin to rain down on the house. That's the beginning that's the prologue as written and shot for Carrie that was never used. The reason it was never used was that the small stones, which were being dumped onto the house set, looked red on film like water. It didn't read as stones. They moved and like raindrops. They seemed to, so it just didn't come across. Now, meanwhile, in the end of the film, when Carrie is in the burning house, enormous boulders fall out of the sky and crush the house. That was as written. But when we cut the prologue, then the stones raining on the house at the end didn't make sense. Plus, I think the night that they shot the exterior of the house, the conveyor belt that was supposed to drop the stones onto the roof jammed, and they couldn't get the stones to work, and the night was coming to an end, and it was going to be dawn soon, and they were losing the dark. And Brian, they had the miniature house on a rig that would sink it into a pit. So the idea was it was supposed to be crushed by stones from the sky, but Brian said, just light the thing on fire and shoot, So they shot it burning and sinking into the pit without the stones. However, they had already shot the interior of the house, that sequence, and in the interior sequence, you see stones coming through the ceiling. So there was a bit of a mismatch there. But we couldn't change the shots in the interior. So if you look at the film now, you'll see shots of stones coming through the ceiling, which is not explained in any way, and people just accept it, or they don't notice it, or whatever. So I also remember there was a scene where Betty Buckley is the gym teacher, and she's punishing the girls for having taunted Carrie in the opening scene. And she has them out on the practice field. And Nancy Allen, who's the bad girl, finally has had enough. She doesn't want to do all these exercises that she's being made to do. And she talks back, and Betty, the teacher, comes over and slaps her.
Well, there are 10 minutes left. Stick 'em up your...
Brian told Betty, slap her. Don't pretend, just really slap her. So, because I want the effect of I want her to react as if she's been slapped, and I want the real thing. So Betty went over and belted her. And Brian said, good, let's do another. And good, let's do one more. And they did about 10 takes, and poor Nancy's face was getting red, and Betty was just really slapping her for real. And I couldn't, I was so surprised at how many takes they did. But when you see the film, you know she's been slapped. And eventually, Brian married Nancy. They met on the film. And Amy Irving, who played the good girl, met Steven Spielberg while she was shooting Carrie. So both Steven and Brian met their wives on the film. In those days, we didn't preview our films, but we would show them. Brian had a group of friends that he would show his films to, people who were knowledgeable about filmmaking, and he would show them the film and listen to their comments, which is an interesting way to go as opposed to showing it to an audience. If you show your film, a rough cut, to experienced filmmakers, they often can come up with very interesting suggestions. In the case of Carrie, we screened the film a number of times for this small group of people, and we would often show the film in a screening room in New York, where the seats were on, the backs of the seats could recline. They were sort of on springs. And Brian and I would sit in the back, and every screening, when the hand came up out of the grave at the end, every seat in the house would rock back suddenly. It was great to watch. So we knew we had succeeded in that moment, that jump. Brian got the idea for the end of Carrie from the end of Deliverance, where you see a hand clutching a rifle emerge slowly from the river. And we saw the picture together. We came out, and Brian said, boy, that ending, I could do that so much better. And he did in Carrie. And the trick to making the scare in Carrie work was to lull the audience into a false sense of security. We used Albinoni's Adagio for string, organ and strings, very sad, dirge-like piece to accompany Amy Irving's Walk to the Grave. And at the first frame, when there's any kind of movement from the hand shooting out, I made certain that it happened in an arrhythmic moment in that music, so that it was surprising. And we cut to the main title of Sisters by Bernard Herrmann in the temp track, which starts with a hammer hitting an anvil. It's a metallic sound, sharp metallic, and we played it very loud. So not only is the audience lulled by this soft, slow, sad music, but interrupted at an unexpected place by a very loud, aggressive noise. And was very successful.